So, friends, so in the last video, we saw that Galen Strawson thinks that we can't make sense of the idea of ultimate moral responsibility, or rather that nobody, or more precisely, that we aren't ultimately morally responsible for our actions, and that's because that we have no control over our starting conditions for character, and that lack of control, in a sense, works its way through successions of later character states. So, his conclusion then is that we're not ultimately morally responsible for any of our actions, right? Because, I guess you could put it this way: if we were to be ultimately morally responsible, then we would have to be ultimately morally responsible for our initial states of character. So what we find in Wolff is we find Wolff arguing that Strawson is wrong, or rather, I guess more precisely, that Strawson's focused on the wrong issues. So just stepping back for a second and sort of thinking a little meta here. One of the reasons why I like this pairing between Strawson and Wolff is that Strawson says, it's like Strawson starts out with a neat idea and then shows that our common sense ideas about responsibility are wrong. Wolff, on the other hand, starts out with our common sense ideas about responsibility and then thinks about things like character and self and being a self and responsibility, and understands those things in light of our ordinary common sense understanding of some of these issues. So really, in a way, it ties back into what we saw with Dennett and his discussion from Sellers of the manifest image versus the scientific image, right? So Galen Strawson is willing to abandon the manifest image in favor of a more precise scientific image, sort of keeping the analogy rough. But with Wolff, we find her willing to tweak the more precise scientific image in order to preserve the manifest image. So, let's get to it then. Wolff's key idea is that we can have moral responsibility for our actions and character, even if we don't have a kind of deep metaphysical responsibility for these things, right? So, she distinguishes between moral responsibility and metaphysical responsibility, and she says we can have the moral responsibility even without the metaphysical responsibility. So how do we do this? Well, she says she endorses what she calls a sane, deep self-view as offering the conditions by which we can assess moral responsibility. So what she holds is that we're morally responsible for an action if it proceeds from a sane, deep self. So again, the core idea for Susan Wolff is this: we are morally responsible for our actions if they proceed from a sane, deep self. So, a few ideas to unpack here. First, how is moral responsibility different from metaphysical responsibility? Second, what do we mean by sane? And third, what do we mean by deep self? So, let's deal with the first one first, right? The difference between moral and metaphysical responsibility. Well, the idea is that with moral responsibility is like our ordinary, everyday sense of responsibility that we have, right? If you rob me at gunpoint, you're responsible for stealing my wallet, right? If you turn in, if you do a great job on a paper and you get an A, then you're responsible for getting the A, right? You're the one who gets credit for it. Metaphysical responsibility is like ultimate moral responsibility. Right, so metaphysical responsibility for an action is whether the buck ultimately stops with you or whether you can pass it on a little bit further down the causal chain. So for Wolff, we can have moral responsibility, right, our ordinary, everyday, common sense notion of responsibility, without metaphysical responsibility. Now, quick sidebar. If you remember at the end of the last lecture, I suggested that Strawson could have that too. Now, Strawson doesn't really go into that. which is itself something that's kind of, well, kind of interesting. But what Wolf gives us is, she says, not only can we have it, but also she gives us the philosophical ideas by which we can have it. Okay, back on course. So we said that we can have moral responsibility without metaphysical responsibility. And we talked about moral responsibility, right? Again, just our everyday notion of responsibility. So she says that we're responsible for our actions, morally responsible for them, if they proceed from a sane, deep self. So, next thing we have to talk about is, what do we mean by a sane, deep self? Well, the first part of that is a sane deep self, right? So let's focus on that first term, sane. So she gives us sort of two hints into understanding what a sane deep self is. She says that a desire is sane. For a desire to be sane is not just desire for any other form of control, right? It's rather that yourself be connected to the world in a certain way, right? So again, one's self is sane, or a desire for a self to be sane, is a desire for ourselves to be connected to the world in a specific way. And she says that sanity is the minimally sufficient ability, cognitively and normatively, to recognize and appreciate the world for what it is. So we have these two insights into the idea of sanity for Wolf, right? That we're connected to the world in a certain way, and that we're able to recognize and appreciate the world for what it is. So let's deal with the first one first. So we might ask ourselves, what does it mean to be connected to the world in a certain way? Well, the best way to throw light on this is to consider what it is to be disconnected from the world, right? So what does it mean to be disconnected from the world in a certain way? Well, it seems like that there are certain things that any sane person should recognize about the world. So, for example, that friendship is a good thing, right? So we want to say that it's sane to recognize the value of friendship. And if you don't recognize the value of friendship, right, if you aren't connected to the world in that way, then you fail to be sane. Or really to be a member of a social community, right? If you don't have a desire to be connected in any deep way to a social community, then we might say that fails a certain test for sanity. So this also, I think, connects with what she says about sanity as the minimally sufficient ability to recognize and appreciate the world for what it is. Right? So again, there are certain things that we just recognize about the world as good, right, or as demanding of us. So we recognize friendship as a good, right? We recognize happiness as an appropriate aim. Right? If somebody were to tell us that they engage in certain activities because they want to be happy, we're not like, so what's so good about happiness, right? You're like, really, why do you want to be happy? Or when we have friends, it's not like we're like, maybe I should consider dumping friendship entirely, right? Like, we don't do that. And if somebody seriously considers those things, then I think we legitimately regard them as failing some criterion of sanity. So we can better understand what Wolf has in mind with her example of Jojo. So you remember that Jojo is the son of the dictator, the cruel tyrant, who believes that that it's okay to rule with an iron fist, that it's okay to be an oppressive ruler to your peoples. So Jojo fails to recognize that things like self-determination or that freedom from pain and suffering are good things. Right? So the reason why Jojo fails to be sane is because Jojo fails to recognize and appreciate certain features of the world for what they are. So sanity then is really I mean, if you want sort of a thumbnail sketch of sanity for Wolf, it's being able to see the good things in the world as good and the bad things in the world as bad. Now, granted, there is a lot of gray in there, right? But I think that's okay for Wolf, because I think she wants her conception of sanity for the sane deep self to be really broad, right? She just wants to exclude, I think she just wants to exclude serious outliers, right? Like JoJo, or anybody, we can imagine somebody raised by a religious cult who believes that it's good to murder people who aren't part of the cult, right? We would say that they fail to be sane. So, we then get to the idea of a deep self. So, what exactly is a deep self? Well, a deep self, it's not just that their actions are within the controls of their wills, right? So it's not just, right, to have a deep self isn't just to have freedom of action. To have a deep self is to have a freedom of will, right? The idea that it's not only what we do is within our control, but the kinds of people we are, that's within our control, right? So to have a sane deep self is to have a self that can be shaped by your choices, that you can choose who you are, and that your choices of who you are reflect a kind of appreciation for the good things of the world as good and the bad things of the world as bad. So, what does this do for us? Well, what it does is it allows us to distinguish between people who have sane deep selves and people who lack sane deep selves. So people who lack sane deep selves fail to be responsible for their actions, precisely because they can't see the world for what it is, right? They don't appreciate the world for what it is. And people who do have a sane deep self are responsible for their actions because they can see the world for what it is, and they're connected to the world in the right sorts of ways, and who they are is within their own control. So what's the difference between a sane deep self and failing to have a sane deep self? What that distinction allows us to do is identify why we want the idea of responsibility, right? Like what responsibility does for us. So to draw the connection between these ideas. So what does responsibility do for us? Well, on Wolf's account, we have the idea of responsibility because it allows us to self-correct, right? So if we didn't have the idea of responsibility, then we would miss out on self-correction. How does that happen? Well, so suppose I cheat on an exam. Right? So holding myself responsible for this, is to say that I can do better in the future, right? That I can correct myself. Now, in order to self-correct, I don't need to have a notion of ultimate moral responsibility. To have a notion of ultimate moral responsibility, I have to self-create, right? So I'd have to be responsible for myself all the way down, right? So, for Strawson, responsibility is importantly tied up with self-creation. So to be ultimately morally responsible for Galen Strawson is to be a self-creator. You have to have responsibility for yourself all the way down to the ground level, right? All the way back to your very beginnings as a human being. Why is that? Well, that's just sort of how Strawson lays out the rules of the game, right? You know, to be responsible for who you are now, we have to trace that back causally to who we were when we first started, doing things like, whatever, right, interacting with others. On Wolf's view, in order to be responsible for who we are, we don't need to go all the way back, right? what we need is to be able to self-correct. And we know that we have this. We see people doing it, right? We see people changing the trajectories of their lives, right? We have people who, if they're alcoholics, they go to Alcoholics Anonymous, right? We have people who, if they notice that they lose friends, well, then they try to act differently, right? We have people where if they're, failing in some area, they try to succeed, right? They try to change their lives so that they succeed in those areas, right? We know that self-correction is a fact of our experience. It's a fact of our lives. So how do we account for this? Well, Wolf just says they have sane deep selves, right? They can recognize that certain ways of living and acting are better than other ways of living and acting. So we're able, in a sense, to self-correct because we have sane deep selves. So, stepping back, what's the big picture for Wolf, and how does it contrast with Strawson? Well, the big picture for Wolf is that responsibility is important because it allows us to self-correct. We get self-correction with the same deep self view. What Strawson misses is that self-creation is unimportant in an understanding of responsibility, right? That our ordinary, everyday, pre-theoretical ideas about responsibility don't require self-creation. Strawson's view of responsibility and of self-creation requires tracing our current state of character all the way back to our, well, really to the moment of our own birth. Now, even before that, right? To the moment when our parents, created us, right? When we were just wee little bits of matter inside of our parents, inside of our mother's wombs, right? Or test tubes, I suppose. So, Wolf, again, wants to hold on to our everyday common sense ideas of responsibility. And to get that, we need sane, deep selves. If you're willing to jettison our everyday, ordinary notions of responsibility, then you go with Galen Strawson's view about self